Let us begin our second panel here, and I have a very high-ranking guests, and I will try to understand what they're telling me, because this is obviously a highly specific subject, but nevertheless a very important one. So I expect a lot of debate that's probably going to be triggered by what the gentlemen here are going to say. So once again, I'm very happy by the level of interaction that's getting through via the Slido thing. Can we just very quickly put back the initial screen so that remind those who have maybe joined us right now and have not been yet informed about the manner of getting involved in the conversation. So go on to the Slido website, www.slido.com or sli.do, enter the event code, and you can participate in the discussion by asking questions and rating questions that have already been asked. Some of them hanging out there are from the previous panel, but well, it's an easy application. You'll find your way around if you use it. So we have discovered that is a good way of you getting involved. A lot of you like to use that application. Right. So our next panel is on the strategic importance of low carbon development and key principles of its implementation. We have three gentlemen on the panel. I mean, your agenda perhaps says that there are four speakers. Celine Ramstein from the World Bank was supposed to be on this panel, but we discovered that she's in Washington, so it would be quite difficult for her to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and to participate in the conversation. So we moved her to a different panel that we will have in the afternoon. So you will hear from Celine, but not during this panel. We have Hans Bruynings from the European Environment Agency. He's Executive Director. We have Simon Buckle here. He's Head of Climate, Biodiversity and Water Division, Environment Directorate at the OSCE. All right, warm welcome to you as well. And we have Artur Runge-Metzger. He is Director of Climate Strategy, Governance and Emissions from non-trading sectors at DG Climate Action of the European Commission. Well, this is an important panel, as you would have gathered from the job description of the gentleman here. Right. What we will do now, I think the working order stays the same. We have the presentations and maybe quick follow-up questions. And during this time, well, whenever you have a question, just go onto the website and type it in. It will reach me, and then I will readdress, if appropriate, to the speakers. So about 10, maybe 15-minute presentations, and then we'll get to the discussion, and hopefully with the involvement of the audience as well. Mr. Bruynings, please.
Good morning. Thank you to the Latvian hosts for inviting me to share some ideas of the European Environment Agency on this important topic. Let's start with where we are at the European level. I think it's obvious for this audience that Europe has triple objectives for 2020. They are called the 20-20-20 objectives, and the good news is that we are well on the way to reaching those objectives when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the breakthrough of renewable energy, but also on energy efficiency. But 2020, you could say, in terms of investments and where we need to be, is almost passé. We're looking towards the future in more strategic ways now. And if we look towards the future, we now have the discussion on the next 2020, which is 2030, where we are looking at necessary trends on renewables, energy consumption, and greenhouse gases. The package is not completely finished, but it's in the, I would say, final stages of political negotiation. So we've got trajectories for the next stage. But we're also looking forward to 2050 now, and the minimum that we should do in greenhouse gas emission reductions, as you know, is minus 80% to minus 95%, but we're also setting targets. We're in the stage of imagining targets for 2050 when it comes to energy consumption and to renewable energy. And depending on how we manage this trajectory and how technologies break through and what political decisions are made, you here see the sort of scope of where we should go towards 2050. Now let's look at where we stand on the sort of focal point of attention, which is the greenhouse gas emission reductions. If you look at the trajectory which we have followed until now, since 1990 at the European level, we have had about 0.9 to 1% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions per year, which brings us well below the 2020 target if the trend line continues. Now, from now to 2030, if we stick to the minus 40% target, we will have to cut emissions by about 1.5% per year. Now, you could say the difference between 0.9 and 1.5 is not that big. Well, it is about 60% more per year. So to those who think that we have already reached a sort of limit of our capacities to reduce on an annual basis, they are in for a rough ride, you could say, because what we expect towards 2030 goes much further on an annual basis. And you see the difference between where we need to be and the measures that we have today. We will need new policies and new measures. But then if you look to 2050, from 2030 onwards, we will need to go to another tripling almost of where we need to be. And that means, in essence, that we will not get there by focusing on efficiency gains in the current technologies. We will need breakthrough technologies, we will need system innovation, we will need different approaches on how we will reach this place. This means that we will need to do more than shift the energy system. I know a lot of attention is going to the energy system when we discuss this topic, and for all the good reasons. But if you look at the roadmap, the sort of trend line that is used in Europe for the moment, you see that even if we end up with minus 80%, it's not just the power sector that will need to reduce emissions. If you look at the residential sector, at industry, at transport, you see serious decreases. And if you take 80% as a sort of minimum, I think it's going to be a very crowded field. Let's assume we have 20% residual emissions, and if you look at the Paris Agreement, to reach well below 2 degrees, there are good reasons from a science perspective to think that 20%, that we will have to go below that. It's going to be a very crowded field because several sectors seem to think that they can have a disproportionate claim on that residual emission, whether it's agriculture, and the previous panel has clearly said in all three speakers that agriculture is a bit of a difficult sector to work with, but you can also think of the aviation sector, of maritime sector, of some parts of heavy trucks. A lot of people and sectors seem to think that they will be able to claim a disproportionate part of that sector. So the message is we will need strong sectoral approaches, because if you add up all those expected outcomes from different sectors, they don't add up. Yeah? Now, in the field of renewables, I think it's important to point out that indeed policies matter and that they do deliver. If you look at the expected trajectory of the use of fossil fuels and you look at the breakthrough of renewables, you see that the distinction between those two lines is the result of policies and investments, and we've been avoiding quite a bit of use of fossil fuels. If you then look at the resulting impact at the level of avoided greenhouse gas emissions, it's clear that the breakthrough of renewables does have a serious impact on emissions and on the use of traditional fossil fuels. Focusing on this region and on the co-benefits of avoiding fossil fuel use, increased use of renewables since 2005 has reduced in this region gross inland consumption by fossil fuels in Lithuania by 12%, in Estonia by 9%, and Latvia by 7%, with of course an increased co-benefit of improved energy security in a region where energy security is often a hotly debated political issue. I will now focus on investment needs to make this transition in the long term. And if we look at the developing policy framework, I would like to do a little bit of backcasting. Where do we want to be in 2050? Well, in 2050, we will need to go to that minus 80 to 95% reduction if we want to stick to the vision that we have for that time period as embedded in the 7th Environment Action Programme, which is living well within the planet's ecological limits. Now, in order to reach that, we are framing a 2030 agenda, and that 2030 agenda is a follow-up of the Paris Climate and Energy Package, the Energy Union in Europe, which is fundamentally linking in a longer-term perspective on energy security, but also on greenhouse gases, renewables and energy efficiency, the climate and energy policies, and also, of course, Europe is linked to a broader global perspective, which is now, in a global language, the Sustainable Development Goals. Which means that if we want to reach that, we need to start investing now. You could say that 2030 and even 2050 in investment cycles is today. If you build a power plant today, it will be functioning in 2050. If you put in infrastructure in transport and mobility, as the public transport that was discussed in the previous panel, it will be there in 2050. If you start using your land in a specific way, for example in afforestation programs, the trees will be there in 2050 most likely. So 2050 is today when it comes to investing in this type of development. And now let's look at what some of those investment needs are. The most obvious areas are, of course, the energy system and avoiding greenhouse gas emissions. And on top of about 940 billion euros per year, the estimates are that we will need to go to about 180,000 additional annual investments in the EU to meet the 2030 targets. Now, that is the cost part of the equation. There's also a benefits part that is not reflected here. Co-benefits in terms of health, where you can look at these policies as almost preventative healthcare in many ways. There are co-benefits in terms of land use, there are co-benefits in terms of energy security, there are co-benefits in many, many areas, but these are the estimated costs. But it goes beyond that. We've mentioned the transport sector as the single sector in Europe right now that since 1990 has increased emissions. And we thought in 2007, 2008 that we had reached the peak and that they were on a downward trend line, but that primarily was caused by the economic recession. Now that the economy is picking up again, we see emissions increase again and the trend line is upward. If we need to follow the decarbonization of transport trajectory, which is now being embedded in concrete European policies, it is clear that transport will have to be a sector with a lot of investments and a lot of innovation. Now, I think it's clear from either the electrification of transport or the breakthrough of much better public transport systems, or whether you talk about smart solutions that are internet-based, a different type of production, local production through 3D printing, there is a whole debate about what could be done in the transport area, but it is clear that investments will be needed there as well. And then I think, in a way, you could say in this debate, the new kid on the block is the whole link with investing in natural capital, biodiversity, ecosystem services, LULUCF, adaptation measures, disaster risk reduction. I think after the Paris Agreement, it is clear that there is renewed attention for adaptation and working with nature in this field. And there is currently an increasingly important debate on how we can invest not only in sort of the energy and hard sectors dealing with mitigation and adaptation, but also in the softer, more green sectors. The whole language about nature-based solutions, bioeconomy, will require investments in nature and biodiversity and soft measures as well. Europe is actually working on an integrated approach towards financing this type of transition towards a low carbon and resilient economy. The high-level expert group on sustainable finance, which will come with a report later on this year that will then most likely be translated in concrete policy steps, is looking at the role not just of green bonds and a little bit of green project money here and there, but at a fundamental transition also in the finance sector to contribute to this whole idea of a low-carbon circular economy and strong resilience. So this is clearly part of the equation now, and I think it's important to mention this because even 2-3 years ago, this debate was at a much lower level of political salience. With the agency, we did an analysis together with our partners in the member states and member countries of the agency to look at whether countries have made plans of where they are with the money that is needed, the investment needs for mitigation and adaptation, and how they relate to their long-term planning. And this is what you see on the left-hand side for mitigation, where you have the map of Europe with quite a bit of green, but also, I would say, quite a bit of red left. And red means that there is, until today, no reported comprehensive view on the investment needs that go along with long-term mitigation planning. Now, Europe is demanding from the member states more and more that they bring these two together, the financing and investment needs to the long-term planning, so this will move almost by definition. On the adaptation side, I think it's obvious that there is even less sort of financial planning. And this is to a certain degree normal, because it's fair to say that adaptation policies are about a decade to a decade and a half behind mitigation policy development. But I think there is a serious need to start formulating the investment needs in adaptation as well. If you look at it from an investor's perspective, having a framework within which to make investments is clearly a basis for moving forward. One of the dangers that we have recognized in a report that we did a year ago, a bit longer, a year and a half ago, is that making the wrong investments can be rather costly. And we looked at all the plants in the traditional power sector in Europe, gas-fired and coal-fired, and how, if we would look at them through an investment cycle of prolonging their life in line with air quality, but also in line with how long could we keep them running. If you then look at the 2030 minus 40% reduction target, our estimate is that up to 1/3 of the capacity of these power plants could be actually in excess or, to use the popular language, to become stranded assets. And this, I think, underlines the importance to link 2030 to 2050. Yeah. You can keep these plants open for a while, thinking that you are well on the way to reaching targets, but you could be locking yourself into investments that have very little future, whereas keeping the 2050 target in mind, those same investment costs could actually open up pathways that they are otherwise closing. So this is an important element. From a social perspective, I think this is equally important, because stranded assets could also lead to stranded workers. Yeah? And we wouldn't want further social disruption in a sector that will be going through a transition already and losing jobs by investments that are not in line with societal objectives. Last slide. If we want to build that sort of energy union and this low carbon future, we do think, and the question came up in the previous panel, that cooperation with neighboring countries in light of European objectives, and I think Melis Munt referred to that, will be needed. Transparency on national policies and projections, and cooperation on planning and implementation, we think is an important need, not only in the Baltic region. The same is true for the Low countries, or for the Iberian Peninsula, or for Southeastern Europe. This is how energy policies will be made in the future in the spirit of the energy union. And in that sense, the further alignment, maybe even on a regional basis, of energy, climate and environmental policies to maximize cost efficiency will be an important part of future investments. We have highlighted in our work the avoiding of the commissioning of new fossil fuel plants and the decommissioning of old plants as critical parts of that strategy to move towards a low carbon future. The Baltic region in that sense has its own particular history. It will have its own particular future, but it's hard to imagine that three countries with a big history, but that are fairly small countries, and I'm from Belgium, so I think I can say that they would do it on their own without connecting to each other and to the broader Nordic and European cycle that we expect under the Energy Union in line with the Paris Agreement. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I think it was very, very informative, and I have a bunch of questions written down that I'd like to expand on, but that will have to wait a minute, because we will now hear from Simon Buckle, please. And please keep those questions coming in, okay? We'll use them either now or later in the sectoral panels. Simon, please.
Good morning, and thank you very much indeed to the Latvian government for inviting me to speak here today. It's my second time talking on climate change in Latvia. 18 months ago, there were fewer people in the audience, so I see that as big progress, and I'll try and keep the positive tone through this presentation. So, the story I'm telling actually is quite a positive one, but I'll intersperse some more depressing facts. It's really around how you can combine a low carbon, low emissions future with resilient and sustainable and inclusive growth. And this stems from a report we did for the German government during their G20 presidency earlier in the year. And that's a picture of our OECD Secretary General handing over a copy of the report to the German Chancellor, with a very nice quote about boosting economic growth doesn't mean locking the world into a high emissions future. And I'll say more about that as we go through. But this is something that I think has given more momentum to efforts to push forward after Paris, and that's very necessary. We heard from the Fijian ambassador that we have COP23 coming up very shortly, and now is a time actually to redouble efforts, not to sit back. And why are we doing all this? Well, this is a very simple chart. It shows you that we will reduce the risk of really bad heat waves, we'll reduce the impacts on crops, we'll significantly reduce the risks of flooding, and we'll have some impact on water stress. What this doesn't show are all the things that we don't really understand properly. How is climate change going to affect ecosystems? So we see forests in North America and Canada being destroyed by pests because they've been stressed by environmental conditions. So invasive alien species, ecosystems change. We really don't know what's coming there. Added to that, we'll have a very poor understanding of what the climate extremes actually will throw up. The models that tell us how the temperatures will change are very good at giving the average changes. They're really not very good at telling us what sort of extremes we're going to face in the future. And they can't really give us a good handle on the potential thresholds in the system. We're doing something that is quite new. People say, yes, temperatures have gone up and down over many years. Yeah, we're taking the climate out of the range in which it's operated over the last million years at least. So we're doing something quite dramatic to the system. So don't be surprised if it comes back and kicks us, because we've kicked the system. If we're going to deliver on the Paris goals of well below 2 degrees, approaching 1.5 degrees, as the ambassador reminded us, these are the sorts of emissions pathways for the energy system that the IEA modelled in their parallel work for the same German presidency. And you can see there the green line is the emissions moving right down by around 80% by 2050, very much in line with what Hans was saying. And the advanced countries, if you like, the high-income countries within that, going down much further, down towards this 85, 90% mark. The developing poor countries obviously taking longer to get there. But this is an emissions pathway that would deliver something like a well below 2 degree scenario. It's achieving 2 degrees with a 66% chance. And we have to talk about probabilities. This is a complex system. Of course, getting onto these pathways raises all sorts of political economy issues. We heard about some of them this morning. We have what we called a few years ago carbon entanglement. A whole development model has been based on fossil fuels, our revenues, government revenues, equally. We have energy security considerations. We have considerations about stranded assets that Hans also mentioned. I think the IEA estimate to 2030 was something like approaching $1 trillion of stranded assets potentially. And if we delay action, that could maybe double or treble. And we also need to think about communities. We need an inclusive, just transition. We need to avoid the stranded communities, just as important as stranded assets. And in terms of sectors, yes, energy is critical, and approaching the electricity sector is often a strategic intervention that can be made. If you don't have a low-carbon electricity system, there's no point putting electric vehicles on the streets. You're not saving any emissions whatsoever. And of course, the agriculture, forestry, land use emissions are critical, not just in terms of the emissions that you can make in those sectors, but they actually set the context for everything else you need to do. So the rates of deforestation we're seeing, the loss of critical carbon stocks, the biosphere feedbacks, that sets the ambition of what you need to do in these energy sectors. And of course there's CO2, but there's lots of other gases, methane, nitrous oxide, as we've heard, in the agricultural sector and the energy sector in particular for methane. And other pollutants like black carbon that are driving change quite rapidly in snowy areas like the high mountain glaciers or in the Arctic. And if you talk to your Canadian colleagues, you'll find out the scale and pace of change that's affecting their indigenous communities. And for heavy industry, we still have a lot of innovation to do. This is not a done deal. Although we've seen massive reductions in the cost of solar and wind, we still need a lot of innovation to deal with heavy industry. And this is one area where the carbon capture and storage solutions that were mentioned by our Estonian colleague could be very important, actually, more important perhaps than in the energy sector itself, the electricity sector itself. So this is one way of showing the challenge for different countries, because every country is different. It has a different mix of emissions, of economic activity, different dynamics. And on the vertical axis, you'll see the carbon intensity of the energy being used in that economy. And on the horizontal axis, you'll see a measure of the energy intensity of GDP. That's the amount of energy it takes divided by the amount of GDP you produce with that energy. So it's a measure of, if you like, the efficiency. And you see to the right, you've got some very inefficient cold economies, Russia and Canada, two particular ones. High up, you've got very CO2 intensive economies, Australia, South Africa, heavy dependence on coal, and same in China. And then you have coming down a set of curves that represent what you need to do by 2020, by 2030, by 2040, by 2050 to be consistent with a well below 2-degree pathway. So this is for the G20 countries. What happens if we put on top some regional countries? That's interesting. So Sweden, well out in front there in terms of very, very low carbon energy supply in particular. Norway, Lithuania, Latvia, all in the middle with varying degrees of energy per GDP, but broadly in the same area in terms of emissions. Finland with less efficient energy per GDP, so there's obviously scope there to move to the left-hand side. Denmark, higher up, more efficient, but higher intensity due to a lot of coal still on the grid, even though they have massive investment in renewables. And then, as we've seen, you could expect this from the shale oil discussion, Estonia has an extremely high CO2 intensity of energy, and in fact, the CO2 intensity of GDP is the highest in the OECD, and that's something we highlighted in our environmental policy review last year as a key challenge. So we know that we're going to have massive investment. We're going to have that anyway, frankly. Even if we don't decarbonize, there's a lot of infrastructure that is aging or that will be built in the developing world where there is no real infrastructure at this stage. So we thought we'd update the numbers on this. We thought about 6.3 trillion need to be invested in infrastructure per year up to 2030. And if we went for a mitigation scenario of well below 2 degrees, that might increase by 10%. But that 10% increase is more than offset by the fuel savings that you would make. So what you're seeing there is an increase in investment in smart energy management, if you like, energy demand side investments that allow smart grids to work. You see investments in the grid itself, transmission and distribution, they're increasing. And that's something that could happen Europe-wide. If you had a grid that was across the European continent, your costs of transition would fall dramatically because you'd be able to harvest the portfolio advantages of having solar in the south and wind in the north. So this is something really to think about quite carefully, how you integrate grids on a bigger scale to get the advantages of different energy resources. And what we see there, of course, is a big decrease in investments in the primary energy supply chain, consistent with the fall-off in fossil investments that Hans was talking about. And current investment actually is lagging this, so we're running well behind. If you look at a lot of the infrastructure in the developing world, some of it needs massive creation of new cities, new roads, rail, everything. So it's not surprising we're well below that, but what's also true is we're underinvesting in the developed world as well. And the claim of this report, backed up by economic modelling as well from our economics department, is that actually these ambitious climate policies are quite consistent with growth pretty much along the same lines that we have now, maybe even a slightly higher. The figures here are levels, they're not annual growth rates, so don't think this is a growth rate of 2.5 in addition. No, this is just a change in the level by 2050. So quite a small effect, but the key message is basically you're doing this and you're not harming growth. But it's conditional on making those investments, maybe some additional fiscal boost there to support the transition. So you're investing in education, measures that will improve hard infrastructure as well. And you undertake structural reforms to improve competitiveness, innovation, and the dynamism of the economies within the transition and the labour markets within the economy. Offsetting this, of course, yes, you have an impact on the energy prices, you have a cost from those stranded assets that we talked about. But overall, there's no negative impact on growth. And if you take into account climate damages, then actually the reason for acting is stronger. And this is just on a very narrow economic basis, without thinking about all the risks of climate change, the tail risks, which are quite significant, without thinking really about the co-benefits for health that Hans also mentioned. So this is a very conservative case in many ways, but it does demand strong policy action, good institutions, and this commitment to structural reforms and investment at the same time. So we end up with a policy framework that requires, at the bottom, in the red, policies targeted to climate change. You need carbon pricing, you need to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, you need sometimes targeted policies to bring through new technologies, as we've done so successfully with solar, with wind now in the UK, also offshore wind. Government procurement can help a lot. The Netherlands has a really good scheme for encouraging clean innovation. Alongside this, you need these pro-growth structural reforms, I'll get my words in the right order, that I mentioned before. But you also need to have the investment environment aligned with the climate policy. You don't need tax breaks that mitigate against this. If you think of a company car scheme that has tax advantages for its employees to have bigger cars that burn more fuel, that's going against the transition. That's going to make it more expensive to make this transition. You need to root out things like that from the tax system, from other areas of policy like planning. And if you do that, you can actually make a more cost-effective transition. So just to illustrate this carbon pricing point, at the moment, more than 60% of the emissions in the G20 are not priced at all. So we think any emission anywhere adds to the global challenge of climate change. It's imposing an externality on other people. We need to tax externalities. That's basic economics. Only 9% of those emissions are taxed at a rate that's greater than 30 euros a tonne. And if you take transport out of the picture, 70% of the emissions are not priced. And this is a measure of an effective carbon price. It takes into account both tax and the implied price from emissions trading schemes, as well as a number of other taxes. And there's a publication that explains the methodology from the OECD, which I think some of you might be interested to read. It's very detailed work going through hundreds and hundreds of regulations and taxes. What does that look like in the region? Well, some countries are doing slightly better than the G20 picture. So Denmark actually has 52% of the emissions taxed at over 30 euros per tonne. Others more in line. Estonia, clearly slightly an outlier in this picture. We heard also about the need to mobilize finance and the importance of the initiatives such as the Financial Stability Board's task force on disclosure of climate-related risks. We heard about the European Union's initiatives, and we've also had a major emphasis in our work on green finance for a number of years, and we have a green finance centre actually within the OECD that cuts across a number of directorates. And increasing private sector investment is going to be critical because the public sectors are not going to have the money in all cases. A lot of countries are under fiscal pressure. Some have more space than others. But even those that have space, they're not going to be able to generate the scale of investment that's needed. So we're going to have to get the institutional investors to put their money into low carbon infrastructure. And this means we need to really understand the risks and returns to those investments. We need to manage those, to give private investors an adequate level of return for their risk without wasting public money. We need to support innovative financial instruments such as green bonds. We need to make the financial system more fully accountable, if you like, of the risks that are inherent there, so that the disclosure by firms of their carbon footprints and the risks they run from the transition to a low emissions economy are vital information for investors to consider when making their investments. So if countries in future want to attract private investment, they're going to be competing against other firms that maybe have very advanced climate change strategies, a well-articulated vision for a low carbon, how they work in a low carbon future. And if companies and countries don't have that, they're not going to get the investment. And of course, we need to use public development banks to mobilize money and to strategically use the public money to leverage the private finance, particularly in developing economies where we also need to work on the enabling conditions, the governance, the rule of law and so on that is so vital to attracting investment. Happily, you're in a different situation here. And just to finish on an upbeat note, this is an extract from the G20 leaders' communique, which basically had all countries but one, shall we say, stating that Paris Agreement is irreversible, and they reaffirmed their strong commitment to the Paris Agreement. And I think it's not just a political commitment anymore. I think you have to just look at the social trends, the financial trends, the technological trends. That change now is irreversible. The only question is, can we make it in time? And that's where governments need to act. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Keep the questions, please, coming in to our speakers here. And we will hear now from Artur Gemetzer, please, who is going to talk to us about the long-term strategy of the European Union with regard to many of the things that we already heard. Please.
No, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to this important event. During the coffee break, I was saying if we would have met 5 years or 10 years ago, I think the presentations would have been very, very different. And I think that just shows how much we have been moving on over the past decade. And I think that is signified in many aspects. I want to briefly talk, and a lot has been said already, so I can be quite short on some of my points. The long-term strategy of the EU, and just to be very clear, we are part of the other G20 countries who are very committed in order to implement the Paris Agreement. I want to talk about the 4 pillars of EU climate policy that show you that we are covering 100% of greenhouse gas emissions. There's nothing left out in the European climate policy. Then I want to go into a few of the sectoral policies, but then also touch upon many other areas that are out there that we will have to tackle if we really want to make headway on tackling climate change. And I will end with a little outlook. So the first slide, and I think I've seen quite a number of examples of that slide already today, but it's just the most important slide ever, I believe, because this slide changed the whole discourse, not only within the EU, but also internationally. When you were sitting in a climate conference in the 90s, it was all about, okay, we can fight climate change, but we also need to have growth. So we can either do one or we can do the other. And the Europeans were sitting there, very lonesome voice at the time, saying, no, no, we can do it differently. We can grow, and at the same time we can reduce our emissions. And only when we were able to show that this is possible in reality, that you can grow your GDP, and Europe has done so by 50% since 1990, and at the same time bringing down the greenhouse gas emissions by 22%, it then triggered a completely different debate which started around the year 2004, 2005, when we were preparing what eventually became the Paris Agreement. Because what it took is the convincing of many of our friends, and it's not just the developing countries, as some say, China and India, but it's also the United States internationally. If we look at Europe, and Hans has been showing this slide, it's very important to embed your policy that you're doing currently into a longer term vision. And we developed that in Europe in the year 2011. We created what is called the 2050 Low Emission Roadmap, which says very clearly that with current policy until 2020, we are not going to get to where we need to be in the year 2050. What it also shows is that all sectors will have to contribute, but they will have to contribute in a different manner because the opportunities, the potential is very different. And it's very simple. You can see that in this slide. If you look at agriculture, which is the pink bar here, going from the left to the right, in 1990, these were about 10% of the emissions of the EU. In the year 2050, they will be about 1/3. And many have said that this morning from the Baltic countries, it's so hard to reduce emissions in agriculture. And it's very clear, how can you forbid a cow to do what it naturally is going to do anyway? So this is something we will have to tackle, but certainly not straight away. We have 3 pillars in Europe in order to cover 100% of our emissions with legislation. Everybody knows about the emissions trading system. It covers around 42% of Europe's emissions, and it is the power sector, it's industry, those companies who are in competition with each other. And what we have here is obligations towards 11,000 installations across Europe, creating a level playing field among them in the single market of the European Union. Secondly, and many have alluded to that this morning, is what is called effort sharing. That is where member states play the pivotal role in order to reduce emissions. And in Europe, that is built on fairness and solidarity, because here the effort is allocated with respect to GDP per capita. And therefore, I think in the slide of the OECD, I think you were showing how different the pricing is in different member states. That is a direct result of that. Because 30 euros in Estonia is very different from 30 euros in Luxembourg. And I think that is something we have to keep in mind in Europe. For the effort sharing, therefore, you will see a range of targets between 0 and minus 40%. 0% for Bulgaria, the poorest country, 40% for the richest country, that is Luxembourg, and the Baltic states are somewhere in between, ranging between 6 and 13%. And then there is the 4th pillar of European climate policy. Sometimes it's the kind of the little orphan of climate policy, and that is adaptation. And the reason it's an orphan is probably because of subsidiarity. This is action that really needs to be done at the level of member states. And the role of the European Union is rather limited. We help in putting numbers together, bringing the scientists together in order to produce these nice graphs, which tell you what is going to happen with the rainfall in Europe. And you can see it's getting drier in the south and it's getting wetter in the north. And the result is even more distinct when you just look at the summer period. And I think if we were to have this slide a little bigger, so also looking at the Middle East, at North Africa, I think we would come to some of the issues you were mentioning in the beginning. Climate change, okay, is one of the policy issues that is somewhere, There's others like migration, but these hang together. Because I think some of my colleagues from the development field say what's happening in the Middle East is probably the first climate crisis we are having, because resources are getting very scarce and people are struggling with each other, and it's turning into wars and it's turning into migration. So there is an aspect here that we should not forget also in Europe, that is going well beyond our own borders, but it's going to affect us within our own borders. So therefore, adaptation just cannot be overlooked, but not only in Europe, also in other countries around the world. But the climate policies, these 4 pillars in itself, are not going to change the economy. They are just setting the broad framework. Everything will have to be done, and Hans put it very nicely, and also Simon was alerting to that you need to look at the energy sector, that you need to look at the transport sector, and there is a number of accompanying policies that are on the table right now that are looking to make sure that we can meet our climate targets. And one of these things is the market design in Europe. We see that the electricity market is not functioning as much as possible. And Simon quoted the number I wanted to quote, that if you were to link up all the electricity markets, you could deliver on your climate target in a much more cost-effective manner. I think that is the reason why we have the new electricity market design proposal on the table. The same is true for energy efficiency. The same is true for renewables. The interesting thing with renewables, though, is that this has become a runner on its own. Kind of think 20 years ago when it was really expensive to build a windmill. Today, this is a business case. And I think what we can see in the Baltic countries, where you have such an uptake of renewables, that there is a lot of good business cases behind that, because otherwise people would not just invest in renewables. And I think that is something we expect to continue into the future. Prices of wind energy, prices of solar energy in Europe are almost at par with fossil fuels, and they are going to get down further. So there is the business case. It's not just being green for the sake of being green. No, it's kind of doing the right investment and getting a good return. It also means energy union governance, and that is something that has been that has been at the center of our thinking in the Commission, that you need to have good integrated planning. When we go around to different capitals in Europe, what we still observe is a lot of silo thinking, different ministries thinking on their own and not working together. So for the first time, we put out this legal obligation for all member states to produce their own integrated plans, to make sure that different ministries are not working in their little corners, but they need to come together in order to make an overall plan for their economy. And I think this morning there were a few examples of this good way of working together forward in the Baltic countries. But we need to see that everywhere happening in Europe. On mobility, I think the question, many refer to it as a difficult sector, maybe not as difficult as agriculture, but a difficult sector. And also here, I think what you cannot expect is that the European Union is going to solve that problem for the member states. It's really a sector where there needs to be a lot of action by member states at the national level, but even more at the level of the municipalities. Public transport was mentioned here. What can we do from the EU side? One area we are working on is the efficiency of cars, CO2 standards, and we will be coming within, I think, 10 days with the new proposals until the year 2030. That is going to give new targets for all European manufacturers. Again, the single market, 500 million citizens and consumers, and try to help also the consumers in terms of what they can save in money they spend on fuels. But it will also have an aspect on innovation to make sure that we still, in Europe, the car manufacturers, there's millions of jobs that are involved in that, will stay in Europe. We see a lot of activity outside Europe. Just look at China. They have just adopted a new policy to really push the electric cars. And the risk is that we are going to lose our technological leadership in Europe, so we need to make sure that we move forward on that side as well. And that means that these electric cars will also have to be sold in Europe. There's an issue on alternative fuels infrastructure, because as much as you do in Riga, as much as you do in Tallinn, as much as you do in other cities in Europe, whether Copenhagen, Paris or so, at the end of the day, the consumer wants to travel from Lithuania down to Portugal and be able to fill the car. And with electricity, that is not yet fully possible, and with other alternative fuels also not. So this is something where we have to look at in Europe, and also again, within the next 10 days, we will make a state-of-the-art report on what are the plans of individual member states and what is still required in order to make the link the I's and the O's and bring this all together. But then I think we need to go a little wider, and I think the previous speakers have mentioned it, that you need to also look at areas that sometimes look very remote. And let me start with something I don't think anybody has picked up this morning, is the skills agenda. If we want to do this transformation, it means, yes, we need to get out of certain industries. And there's a lot of fears in those industries. And I just have to mention the word coal. There's countries in Europe that rely to more than 90% on the coal industry. And we know by 2050, they will have to make headway to really get out of that. But there's tens of thousands of people employed in there, and I think even the younger generation there, the sons and maybe even the grandchildren, still think of, maybe I want to become a coal worker like my father or my granddad. So we need to reskill. We need to think of changing the skill structure in those parts. And it's very, very hot spots we have in Europe looking at that. So it's not only lock yourself out of coal, but it's also what do you do with the people and look at the social side and the skills agenda. This digital single market has been mentioned by Estonia as something where there's new opportunities where you can improve the efficiency of the energy market, you can improve the transport sector, but you need to think of that early on in order to make the move forward. Innovation is something we can just not forget. If you look at the industrial sectors like steel industry in Europe, which is one of the big emitters, if you look at cement industry in Europe, of course, we also want to keep those industries in Europe. And the scientist will tell you, oh, I can produce steel with 80% less CO2 emissions. But unfortunately, none of these steel plants has yet been built in Europe because it's risky. We don't know the technology. It's new. So who is going to put money into these risky technologies? There's clearly a role of governments to make sure in the next 5 to 10 years that we put up these huge lighthouse projects in Europe to make sure that we can show you can produce steel with 80% less CO2 emissions. I believe the European Union will have to play a particular role in that. I'm not going to touch on the Capital Markets Union because Hans did that so nicely, and also on investments. I will leave that for the discussion maybe. Finally, in the beginning it was said, yeah, the citizens think we have done enough on greening, maybe we shouldn't do more. It is not just greening for the sake of greening. It is also there to make our economy in Europe more efficient and more effective and more competitive worldwide. If we fulfill our Paris Agreement, You can see here the EU 28 will be at the top end. It will be the most efficient economy in terms of CO2 emissions per million of US dollars GDP compared to all the others. And that has many other positive side effects. Energy security, Hans mentioned it, is one of the very important ones that we have in Europe. But also want to leave you with a little pouring water into the wine, and that is this graph here. And that really brings me back to what the ambassador was saying this morning in his introductory speech, that yes, and Hans showed it, and Simon, you showed it, we know how to get to the 2 degrees. But we know that we are still quite far away from it. We are at these 3%, 3.3% changes, so that means somewhere in the middle, but we are not yet at the green line down there. And that is only the 2 degrees. The 1.5 degree line is even further down. So there's also something we need to do in terms of reflection in the coming years, and from the side of the European Union, we want to come back to our 2050 strategy in the coming 2 years to see what more needs to be done. At the same time, what we know is a lot has changed, particularly the prices of many of those new technologies. So the curves could still look very feasible economically as the one that we did in the year 2011. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I have to say, out of all of the presentations, I liked Simon's the best because you had at least one graph that showed that Latvia is ahead of Estonia, a certain, one specific instance, but nevertheless. Hello to our Estonian friends there. Okay, good. I have to say, we've got 8.5 minutes left for the discussion, but that is not something I really resent because all of your presentations were very informative, and I think they gave a lot of food for thought and sort of threads which to pursue in our sectoral debates. However, what I wanted to do, sort of to give all of you an opportunity to reflect on. So, would you be able to give me, I'm trying to imagine the audience here coming, most of them from the Baltic states, from different sectors. If you could give them, I don't know, 2 or 3 or 4 examples, good and bad from your perspective, to sort of illustrate the points you were making. For example, Hans, you were telling us about the stranded investments and the danger of that. And maybe you have, I don't know, very specific examples. Country X or country Y. I don't know whether you want to put anyone on spot, but here, this is because the investment cycle, maybe if we're talking about 2030, you were saying investment cycle begins today. No, investment cycle began for 2030, begin 5 or 10 years ago, right? So maybe you have very clear examples of what is a stranded investment in one country or another, or in one industry. So maybe you have good and bad examples, and you as well. You were talking about that Europe is basically getting its point across and actually proving the case that you can have a GDP growth at the same time reducing the carbon footprint. But nevertheless, within the European Union, there might be countries and industries that are maybe not up to the task, or maybe leaders in that regard showing. So maybe you as well have very specific examples of that. And Simon, that as well, OECD is what it does, right? It compares different best practices across the board of countries. So, for the benefit of the audience, I tried to imagine what could be the biggest contribution that we can give in our 5 minutes in your concluding statement. So, good and bad examples, specific ones, to illustrate the points that you made. Who wants to chip in first? All right, all of you agreed that we put you on the spot first. Let's go, please. Is it? Now try?
No?
Yes, good.
Now it's working. I think it's the hardest question you can put to a EU official,
Yes.
to then say, oh, this country is good and that country is bad.
Let's call it country
And-
X.
And I think even if you do a deep dive into the numbers in terms of examples looking at, okay, who is doing well and who is doing bad where, you will always find many countries who are doing something very good, but they at the same time also do something maybe not that good. While I don't think there is one country that is really bad, of course, except for my home country. So if you look at some good countries, I think Simon was putting the finger on Sweden, that has a very proactive policy already for a long time, that has put a carbon price out there, which changed, for instance, the heating in Sweden completely over the previous decades. So you could say, yes, Sweden is a good example for that. I think this morning we heard on renewable energy that all the Baltic countries are exceeding their targets. So that must mean this is something that has been resonating here. And I think what was also played an important role is that, of course, you have been experiencing the collapse of the former Soviet Union. So that meant there was a lot of not stranded assets, but assets that let's say, that were stranded there already for a long time because they were very old and overdue to be replaced. So new investment was required, and there was people were encouraged to do that into the right direction, which means into the renewable energy. And again, I don't think that it was a single reason for that, meaning they did it just because of greenhouse gas emission reductions. No, the energy security played an important role, of course, for the Baltic countries as well. If you look at transport, you probably will have to go city by city in Europe. And the one that always strikes me when I go and visit Hans in Copenhagen is Copenhagen. If you look at the amount of bicycle traffic that is there and how they are giving priority to the bicycles, that is extraordinary across Europe. And you will find other examples where you say integration of public transport and reforming public transport. You will find also quite a number of very good examples. But don't go to Brussels, please.
All right.
So there is kind of a lot of good examples out there, and we can learn from each other. And that is, I think, one of the functions of the European Union, to bring member states together, to bring also mayors of cities together under the covenant of mayors in Europe, to really allow them to learn these lessons from each other.
Well,
I think that is a particular strength of Europe.
Well, thank you very much for this. Simon, you want?
So I think
it's good, yeah.
Yeah. In terms of dramatic changes, I'd just highlight that China's cancelled hundreds of gigatons of coal-fired power plants. So it decided that it wasn't going to build them. And admittedly, there's still a huge problem. I think the remaining plants that are still due to be built are about the same size as the entire power sector in Canada. So that's a huge problem. But they're moving. And they have a problem in terms of employment, in terms of how they have to balance the economic and political developments there. So China has done a huge amount. I think there was a lot of discussion about agriculture, so maybe it's worth thinking a little bit about an example there. And in Europe, I think Denmark has perhaps one of the most advanced approaches to thinking about how it manages reactive nitrogen pollution. Nitrogen that comes largely from fertilizers, but also, particularly in Paris, it's an issue that comes, the air pollution there comes both from the ammonia emissions from agriculture, but also the nitrous oxide that comes from car fumes. So you get these poisonous smogs occasionally, and it's really damaging. But the bit of nitrogen that we're really worried about from a climate perspective is nitrous oxide, which is just one form of nitrogen. But any nitrogen, whether it's in water or air, can be turned into this. So we need to manage inputs of nitrogen into the whole system. And as you say, that's very hard when you have population growing, economies growing, demand for food, and increasingly as people get wealthier, for meat growing. And that impacts on methane too. But nitrous oxide is more important to me because it's more of a long-term gas. Methane is something that's in the atmosphere for 12 years, maybe then turned into CO2, a small amount of CO2. It's very powerful in those 12 years, but nitrous oxide is really important to manage. Denmark is looking farm by farm to see how it can manage those flows and has instruments to regulate that. So that's really interesting.
Okay, good. Actually, a bunch of questions about the agriculture. That they will have to be tackled in our agriculture panel, but a very, I think, an interesting thread of our discussion, because as all of you mentioned, I mean, agriculture is the newer field. If the other sectors have become more accustomed to the realities of the future, then the agricultural sector is something where you see, as Hansel as well was telling, a lot of resistance and a feeling of entitlement that is perhaps not concerning us. In any case, Hans, your examples of good and bad practices?
Yes. Well, Copenhagen has been mentioned. Is this working? No? Hello? Yeah. No?
Yes.
All
good.
right. Good.
Yes.
Copenhagen has been mentioned for mobility. I can say that 84% of the urban mobility in a city of 1 million is either cycling, public transport, or walking. And Brussels is also a city of 1 million. Being Belgian, I think I can compare a bit. And it's rather obvious that choices matter. Yeah? That they deliver completely different results when it comes to, for example, traffic jams and the use of transport modi. But I would also like to say that Copenhagen, in terms of district heating and new buildings, can be looked at as an example. I live in an apartment in Copenhagen, a fairly new one, and I have used my heating system 3 times in 4.5 years because it's not necessary. I mean, the building is so well made that the heat that is in the building is enough to stay above, a certain temperature. Now, my wife sometimes thinks it's a bit too cold, but that's another issue. That's a family issue. Huh? The other thing, since we talked about climate adaptation, Copenhagen is also a city where they're doing a lot on climate adaptation. And if you look at the predictions for the end of the century in the Baltic states in terms of increase in precipitation, this is clearly an issue to take into account. A good example of a region that was a coal mining region is actually in Belgium. It's Limburg. It was a coal mining region. It is now the region in Belgium that is leading on research and development for renewable energy and the energy future. So you can really transform a region in the energy system from going from an old one to a new one. Another example there is part of the Ruhrgebiet in Germany, where Essen was voted green capital in Europe. I would say it's not just a green capital, it's a region there that is reinventing itself. If I then want to follow Arthur's advice and say there is nothing that is totally good or bad, it's of course also in Germany that you have an increased use of lignite in some areas. So it's always a story of, how does market and policies and visionary investments and transitional policies interact with each other. If I would look at this region, and then I'll stop, I think it's clear that if you look at the idea of the smart economy, digitalization, using personal devices to steer habits of people, that Estonia is a country that in a European comparative perspective is very far advanced. And then the question becomes, how do you use that for a sustainable transition, and not just as a tool to give consumer information in general, but how do you steer it in this direction? And last week in a conference in Estonia on nature-based solutions, there were ample examples of how you can use the digitalization of the economy also to steer people and enterprises in that direction. I thought I would make up for Estonia since you blamed them for, So.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's a very healthy competition we're having, but that's a family issue as well, you might say. Okay, good. Fascinating, gentlemen. I don't have the time more to pick your brains because the lunch will be getting cold, and we don't want that to happen. So I have to end it now. But before we break for lunch, I have to. You have all the agendas with you, so it's going to become a bit complicated now because we have two sets of sectoral sessions right now, and you will have to choose in which you want to participate. So the next round of sessions are going to be energy, stays in this room, but the transport and agriculture sectors move on to the different halls right there, and my colleagues Ingrid and Christine are going to be moderating those two sessions. And then another coffee break and another set of those sectoral sessions. And then we come back at 4:30 here, hopefully all of you, and as many people as possible coming back here for a very brief session when we will do the summing up of what we heard today and why is it important and what sticks out as the most relevant. So thank you very much. Let us give a good round of applause to our panelists today. It was a fascinating talk.